Okay, so our case is of Betty, and Betty wants to remain a slave. And the judge agreed with her. She wants to. As a northern state, we only have to allow her to make that choice, but it's up to her to make that choice. So should a person be free to choose to be a slave? If they want to, why not? They can do whatever they want. Isn't that what freedom is about? Doing whatever you want? So there's really, in general, you ask philosophers about this question, they get very nuanced into this idea of negative freedom versus positive freedom. Anyone familiar with this concept? Negative freedom versus positive freedom? So negative freedom, negative liberty says we have to make sure we're not holding people down, holding people back. As long as we're not holding people back, they're entitled to do whatever they want. So we just have to make sure we're not holding people back. Positive liberty says, no, it's much deeper than that. We have to make sure people are doing their purpose, what they believe, what's meaningful. So we cannot just say, do whatever you want. If you want to sit on the couch and play games all day, that's your choice. That's not real freedom. Because maybe he's playing games all day because he doesn't have a good education. He doesn't have opportunities in life. So real liberty is giving people opportunities. And sometimes those opportunities come at a cost. They have to go to school while they're children. There's sacrifices that we impose on groups in order to help them be more free and have a more fulfilling meaning in their life. So there's a conflict. These two theories are not, some scenarios they come out on the same side, but in many scenarios, these two views of freedom come out different. Should a person be free to kill themselves? Should a person be free? Should children be free to do life-altering surgery? All these questions, it depends which camp you fall into. If you fall into the negative liberty camp, we should never tell anyone no. If we can say yes, we say yes. It doesn't matter if we agree with their choice or don't agree with their choice. If they want to do something, even if we view that choice as a negative for them, this view of negative liberty says liberty is a human right, and it means people have the right to make bad choices and to be lazy or to do foolish things. People have a right to be stupid, right? That's the view of negative liberty. There are other ethicists say, no, the human right to freedom is all about positive liberty, about giving people opportunities to have a purposeful life. Now, which side do you come down on?
The positive liberty.
Positive liberty? So people don't have a right to make stupid choices?
Well, you follow a blueprint, which is the Torah, that gives us amazing guidance. It's freedom.
Now let's try to apply these two groups to Betty's case, right? Group number one, the truth is it's not so clear. You could be in both camps and still be unclear. If you're a negative liberty, yes, you come out for sure. Betty's entitled to become a slave. That's her right. Doesn't matter if we don't think it's good for her. But even if you're in the positive liberty group, you might still agree that Betty has a right to indenture herself because she finds this work meaningful and she finds this activity wholesome. So even no matter which camp you're on, you might still agree that Betty has the right, as the judge agreed, that she has the right to make herself a slave. And we should not impose on people what purpose means to them. What somebody else's purpose to you is slavery. This woman wants to be a mother of 8 children, and this other woman says slavery. Everyone has their view on what's meaningful and liberating. So let's just to solidify this concept.
Rabbi, can
Yes,
I just
Barbara.
say, obviously when we're only getting snippets of what the judge's decision was.
You could read
But-
it in text. You could read it in text 1 if you want to.
Okay, well, I guess I will read it, but the issue is that if someone is free to be a slave, meaning they could be enslaved, but at the same time, if they wake up the next day or wake up the next hour, the judge said, if they want to be free, they can. So their freedom of choice is what appears to have been protected. Meaning if they
It was
want,
only protected while they were in the northern states. As soon as
Right.
Betty goes back to Tennessee, her freedom, now if she changes her mind, too late. She can't change her mind anymore.
right,
She's a slave. So that was the dilemma that they were grappling with. Let's take a look at text 2. Stan, if you can read for us text 2.
Two theories of freedom. Negative liberty is the absence of obstacles, barriers, or constraints. One has negative liberty to the extent that actions are available to one in this negative sense. Positive liberty is the possibility of acting or the fact of acting in such a way as to take control of one's life and realize one's fundamental purposes. The idea of distinguishing between a negative and a positive sense of the term liberty goes back at least to Kant and was examined and defended in depth by Isaiah Berlin in the 1950s and 1960s.
Okay. So in this exercise 4.1, we asked which of these definitions of freedom resonates more with you. And initially, before I started the class, I was trying to gauge people's response, and I saw the way people were heading was towards negative liberty. This is the most intuitive to us. Don't tell others what to do. Let them do what they want. If they want to be slaves, that's their choice. But then, as we discussed it a little further, we saw that more people were moving into the positive liberty, that actually allowing kids to grow wild and not to give them education actually limits their opportunities in the future. And so that's not real freedom. A real freedom is sometimes comes at us limiting what they can do in order to create better opportunities and better making them more free agents. And we came out how in Betty's case, even in Betty's case, both views could still be consistent with allowing Betty to remain a slave. So choosing slavery means not being free to pursue one's purpose. That's what it means when you choose slavery. You cannot change your mind about what your purpose is. Once she moves back to Tennessee, she's hooked on a purpose of being a slave. She cannot decide she wants to go to college now and get a degree. So who defines a person's purpose? Slavery for one purpose, maybe freedom for another. So if she, even in positive liberty, if she wants to be a slave, maybe she finds that freeing. She likes the structure, she likes the rigidity, she likes the family, the known. And you should know that Torah has a lot to say on this topic. In fact, in Torah tradition, most Jews that were in Egypt did not want to leave Egypt. They found it very secure. They knew what their life was. Their life was a life of building pyramids for the higher ups. There was a pyramid scheme, Pharaoh at the top, the priests of Egypt and the magicians underneath, the lower class, and the Israelites at the bottom. And they felt very secure in knowing where they belong. And now Moses is saying, we're going to go into the desert. And what's going to happen? What are we going to eat? What's going to be? That loss of security was very frightening to many Jews, and they didn't want to leave. And God almost had to force them out, rush them out, many Jews, in order to leave. So Judaism is very involved in actually what is freedom all about and what does it mean. And that's why we have a whole holiday of Passover is dedicated to finding out, to getting in touch with our personal freedom. Let's read text 4. Let's read text 4. But after all is said and done, we find something very shocking. You'd think that the Torah, that's all about freedom, wouldn't have any rules. But we can't be further from the truth. Although freedom is a foundational Jewish value, and our birth as a nation began once we were liberated, but what's the next phrase? Moses, take my people out, let my people go. What's the next part of the phrase? So that they may serve me. So it's almost like God said, the Jews cannot be slaves because they're my slaves. So what kind of freedom is that? That's not real freedom. We went from one set of obligations to serving Pharaoh and Egyptians to now we're under God's jurisdiction and God's our boss and he's controlling us and micromanaging us. He tells us how we can sleep, how we can eat, how we can work, who we can marry. So we just set aside one boss for another boss. So you think, okay, no, I never heard of this, because Judaism puts it under the rug, buries the secret. They only speak about the first half, let my people go, and they don't discuss so much the second half. But that's not the case. Actually, in text 3, the sages say it bluntly. No person is free except for those who occupy themselves with Torah. Only those who keep Torah and mitzvahs are really free. So they don't only not ignore it, they actually lean into it. And they say, actually, real freedom comes from doing Torah and mitzvahs. And that's very unintuitive to us. So we're going to spend a few moments to understand what is the logic and how does this work. And I hope by the end of this small discussion, we'll come to realize that it actually does resonate with us and it seems more true. In text 4, God says, the children of Israel belong to me as servants. They are my servants whom I brought out of Egypt. I am your God. So what's the secret? What's the truth? How do we reconcile this?
Well,
So someone wanted to say something?
no, I was going to say, it sounds like I am your parent. I'm trying to justify these words, but it does sound very like I am your master. You are my slave. It does sound like that, but
Right.
yeah.
Right. Now, just so we understand how important freedom is, it's a mitzvah every day for a Jew to remember that God made him free, that he was taken out of Egypt. And we should always remember to do everything we can to securing our freedom and to never be enslaved, not to other people and to our most difficult taskmaster to get rid of, which is our evil inclination that sometimes has control over us. And we know we want to escape from his slavery, and we just can't. And we get addicted to the same bad habits, and we want to escape and move on. And so it's a mitzvah to remember Egypt every day, our liberation, and try to reenact it every day. And that's what the Passover Seder is all about, not just recalling, but actually to guide us how to arrive at that freedom. So we say it in the Shema in the morning, we say it in the Shema in the evening, we dedicate a whole Seder. But the sages say true freedom is through the Torah laws, which is so shocking. Laws make a person free. How is this possible? So I want you to take a moment to do a small meditation with me. Close your eyes. Think about a rock. This rock wants to experience true freedom. What does it have to do to experience true freedom? Nothing. It just has to remain a rock. However, Next to the rock is a beautiful rose bush. And the rose bush is growing. And comes along a person and says, Rosebush, I want you to be just like that rock. That rock doesn't move. That rock doesn't grow. I want you also not to grow. That's the opposite of freedom for the plant. For the plant, freedom is to be its true identity, to grow. And it's true, growth takes work. But for the plant, this is life. Life is growth. And I need plants. I need to be tethered to the soil. I need water. I need sunlight. Someone who comes to the plant that says, poor you, you're stuck to the ground. I want to provide you freedom. Look at this rock. I throw it into the sky. It's happy. Let me take you, rosebush. Let me rip you out of the ground. Let me throw you into the sky. Pure freedom. But for the rose, that's not freedom. Now you go on to the animal. Think of a cute pet. And you say, that plant is happy to grow, but it doesn't need to move around. So I'm going to take you and chain your legs to the ground. You'll remain attached to the ground forever. But you can grow. I'll feed you. You can get bigger. You can get larger, just like the plant. But you cannot move. For that animal is not truly free. Because it's not living to its full animalness, which is movement, exploration, seeing other parts of the world. The plant is peaceful and tranquil with just seeing the same backyard from morning to evening. But the animal needs to explore, needs to move, needs to travel. And while a human needs all that, a human needs much more. It needs to be free to think, to discuss, to use the analytical mind. And what's freedom for the Jew? Freedom of the Jew is to be Jewish. A Jew wants to be Jewish, like a plant wants to be a plant, and a rock wants to be a rock, and an animal wants to be the best animal it can be. And this is the root of Judaism's view of real freedom. Real freedom, in other words, it has an advantage. It takes positive liberty, but it has an opinion about positive liberty. The ethicists that propose positive liberty, they're stuck because they don't know how to define purpose. They say, who are we to judge what somebody's purpose is? And they're absolutely right. Humans are not the ones to judge. Who's the one to judge what ultimate liberty is, what it means to fulfill your divine purpose? It's your creator. So a lot of this is intuitive. Everyone can wake up from the meditation, but a lot of this is intuitive to us. Yes, I feel good when I take care of my children. Why? Isn't that work? Why do people find it meaningful to take care of their children? Why do people find it meaningful to take care of their loved ones? Because this is who they are. And the fact that they can express who they are brings them freedom and joy. So, we're so busy consuming and seeing what life has to give to me. But anyone who knows a little bit about the human condition knows that doesn't bring joy. People that are stuck in consuming and thinking about what life has to give me and not what I am needed for and what I can give to life never tasted real happiness. Because real happiness is about doing what you were here to do. So if you have an ability to draw art and you're restricted and you're told you cannot draw art, that's not freedom. Because God created you with a creative mind, so you have to use that mind. However, Just like the plant needs the proper nutrition, the proper soil, the proper shade, the proper sunlight, not too much water, not too little water, so to us, when we express our creativity, we have to make sure that the creativity will nourish us and not deplete us. How will we know the right balance of when we're going too far or when we're using it the right amount? And that's a constant journey that we take as we study Torah. So the sages say the only one who's truly free is someone who studies Torah because he really knows what he needs to make himself happy, to meet his full potential. When you meet your full potential, you're truly free. Text 5, the Talmud takes this past the statement that we read in text 4. The children of Israel belong to me as servants. With this verse, God is saying, they are my servants, not servants to other servants. And that means a Jew has to be free to always be a devoted Jew. He cannot work for anyone. He cannot be enslaved to any other human being.
So what about non-Jews? Like, I mean, they have the Noahide laws, but even though people in general have this moral compass, what is their, like for someone who's not religious and doesn't follow like a religious
Well, the Noahide laws are not just 7 mitzvahs. There are 7 very broad categories. So for the Gentile, can I use the word Goyim here? Is that okay? Goyim have the mitzvah of tzedakah. Which part of the 7 Noahide laws is that? That's the mitzvah of having a just society. The mitzvah of having a court and a just society. Part of that is tzedakah. Part of that is respecting your elders. So they actually do have more than 7 mitzvahs. It's just they're much broader categories, and there's a lot more ebb and flow within the society. Not all nations have to look identical to be in fulfillment of the 7 Noahide laws. One nation could decide that our value system for our justice system should be weight more personal freedom, and another society could say we weight heavier equal rights, and they could both be in fulfillment of the 7 Noahide laws. So the 7 Noahide laws on the one hand are very general categories, and that allows for different nations to express their own unique character that they have. And the Torah recognizes that each nation is different and serves a different purpose and a different goal, and they have a different way of connecting to Hashem. And as long as they're trying to achieve that, that's good. What's interesting is some people say, hold on, Rabbi, you're saying that the Torah doesn't allow humans to be slaves, but doesn't it say that Jews could own non-Jews as slaves? Isn't that part of the Torah? But the truth is, as the sages made clear, that it's not, if a Gentile comes over to you and says, I want to be your slave, you're not allowed to buy him as your slave. However, if someone comes with a slave, they own a slave, and they want to sell it to a Jew, they're allowed to sell the non-Jewish slave to a Jewish master. Why? Because the sages see it as an upgrade. When a non-Jew becomes a slave to a Jew, he has to keep Torah and mitzvahs. Any mitzvah that Jewish women are obligated to fulfill, that means all the negative prohibitions, as well as many positive mitzvahs, non-Jewish slaves have to fulfill. So it's considered like an upgrade. And if the Jewish owner will ever free this non-Jewish slave becomes a full-fledged Jew. So this was always how Judaism saw slavery, that better to, when he's in a pagan home, who knows what could be going on there. And there was a special mitzvah of kindness that the Jews had towards their slave. Maimonides goes into detail about the importance of masters being kind to their non-Jewish slaves. And there were many cases where, people needed a minion, and there was only 9 Jews. Okay, so we'll free our slave. Then we have our 10th Jew for our minion. And that's used to happen from time to time. Okay. So
How do employees fall under this category? Like a housekeeper or just any employee, a janitor or someone who works behind a desk, anyone.
yeah, well, this whole class is going to be about that topic. Okay. So when we're trying to transfer our discussion into what we just spoke about, negative liberty says we're free from subjugation in Egypt. But for what purpose? Freedom to live a purposeful life. So Torah tells us the freedom to live a purposeful life is the freedom to be oneself. Let me get some student books. Okay. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of the class. Okay. So enslavement to another being is a non-human state, and the Torah does not allow for it. A Jew is not allowed to be enslaved even to a Jewish person. It's prohibited. It's not allowed. Why? Because he loses his capacity to explore his connection with Hashem and to live out his full humanness and Jewishness, because he's always dictated by someone else making all the decisions, which I know where we're thinking, hold on, my job has a lot of constraints on me that don't allow me to live out my full potential. But we're going to explore that. But choosing to be a slave is naturally impossible. So in secular ethics, a person who wants to be a slave, that's his right. If you have a negative liberty view or you have a positive liberty view, it's his choice, it's her choice. She's allowed to. She finds meaning in this choice. It doesn't matter that by choosing this choice, she removes from herself the ability to ever go in a different direction. A human, according to Judaism, can never give up his free will, sign off his free choice, his autonomy. He must always be in possession and ability to break free. And
Rabbi,
that's
how do you compare that with the Torah or the Chumash that talks about, if the Jew wants to stay a slave, he could put a nail in his earlobe.
that was unique. You're right, that's a unique kind of slavery, and the Torah punishes him for doing so. And for this very reason, it's for the reason why we put a nail through his earlobe is to tell him, you're not listening to what God tells you. God tells you that you're my servant, and now you're giving up your service. And so even that unique exception of the slave, a regular person wasn't allowed to go into that kind of slavery. It was a unique case for someone who stole. He doesn't have money to repay his debt. Then he went into slavery. He came attached to his family. Then we say you could extend your slavery a maximum of 50 years. So even 50 years is a long time. But it wasn't 50 years on his choice. It was whenever the next Jubilee year was. Then whether he wanted to stay or not, he wasn't even allowed to stay. So there was an exception for that specific narrow case that he's allowed to stay on, but it's not forever. And if he wants to leave, he's allowed to leave.
And non-Jews were not allowed to leave.
What?
You didn't have to release non-Jews.
That's right. That's right. But that's because they were coming from a state of, when they were by their non-Jewish masters, they also didn't have to leave.
Yeah.
So you're right.
So, Rabbi, what is, when you say free to be you, when you're a slave, you're told not to be you?
Well, in other words, and here, let's try to put it, we'll spill the beans in the beginning. you're allowed to say, I want to walk on my hands every day. You could do that. And that might be the wrong choice. But the Torah gives you free choice and allows you to make the wrong choice. As long as at any moment you could decide to make the right choice. So you cannot make a choice that will remove from you the ability to change your mind in the future. And that's the difference. So can you sign up to a 10-year contract? No. You could sign the document and it's a mitzvah to keep your word, but if you want to leave, you're allowed to leave. It doesn't matter if you have it written, signed in blood. A person is at a job that he committed to, that he's going to be here for 3 years. He has every right to leave. Now, it's not nice to break your promise, but this idea of a person cannot be enslaved to another human being is paramount. And I know I'm giving away the meat and potatoes of the course, but I think that will clarify a lot of the questions that you're having right now in your mind.
But Rabbi, what about in relationships, right? Isn't part of our relationships to grow and if you're going to grow and you're taking the suggestion of perhaps your significant other who gives you advice or recommendations, is that's consistent with this, that's okay, even though you're taking someone's advice, even though they're not forcing you, you're choosing to do it, to change, I suppose.
So marriage is actually a very unique perspective in Judaism that actually is a little different from whatever we're going to discuss here in class. It doesn't necessarily apply to a marriage relationship. It's quite unique. But in general, even in a marriage relationship, no spouse actually has any control over the other spouse. And you don't, that's not the mitzvah of marriage to tell your spouse what to do. That's not there's just certain commitments that you have to each other, and those commitments have to be kept. They have to be kept.
Rabbi, there appears to be a contradiction there. Let me see if I can quote this properly. Doesn't the Torah say, "Ve'im amor yomar ha'eved, ahavti ed adoni ed ishti ve'es banai lo etzeh chafshi"? So isn't that insinuating that a person has the liberty to say, "I want to remain a slave"?
So that was Ken's question, and it's simply that was a narrow case. That wasn't any Jewish slave. That was a specific Jewish slave, and the slavery is very different than what we think as slavery. He couldn't give him, clean my backyard. You can't tell him to do that. You have to give him a specific limited task. Say, clean my backyard until 1 o'clock. There was a lot of rules and regulations, and it said whoever acquired for himself a Jewish slave actually acquired for himself a master, because he had to give the best. He had to give breakfast to his slave before himself, and there's a lot of conditions. And even then, at the end of 7 years, when he's supposed to be freed, if he wanted to be enslaved further, there was a special procedure where we tell him, "You're doing the wrong thing," and we put a nail through his earlobe to tell him, "You're not listening to what God wants of you." And even then, once he continues being in this relationship, he could always leave the relationship. He could opt out, and it becomes a mandatory opt out in the Jubilee year. So it's different than Betty's case. Okay, so let's read in text 7, as Reb Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin puts it, slavery is an unnatural state. The natural order of the universe is that animals are under the dominion of human beings, but it's against the natural order for a human to be a slave to another human. It's just not normal. And now let's take these values and principles that we set up, and we're going to apply it to different cases. So let's look at case study A. This was a real case that happened in Spain under the great rabbi, Rabbeinu Asher ben Yechiel. He was actually a rabbi from Germany in the 1100s, but he had to run away. And he was an Ashkenazi rabbi, but he was so regarded and respected that the Sephardic community adopted him as their chief rabbi. So he kept Ashkenazi customs with his family, but he was so renowned that he led the greatest Sephardic community of its time, which was in Spain. Spain actually means Sephard. Sephard means Spain. That's where it comes from. So here's the case that was presented to him. Reuven borrowed money from Shimon and failed to repay the loan. Okay? Reuven is now living with a relative where he eats good food and dons expensive clothing. His wife is similarly expansively attired and even provides gifts to her friends. Reuven claims that all of this is provided by his relative, whereas he personally is penniless. He sits idle and refuses to engage in any labor or business of the type he had always performed in the past, because he knows that any money he earns will necessarily go towards repaying his loan. You be the judge. What would be your decision if such a case came before you? Okay, so Reuven owes money. By the way, in the Talmud, Reuven is a placeholder name because Reuven was the first son of Jacob and Shimon is the second son and Levi is the third. So all the cases in the Talmud, you're like, who is, wow, so many, why is Reuven giving Shimon another loan after what Shimon did to Levi? Yeah, but it's really just a placeholder name. It's the John Doe of the Torah is Reuven and Shimon. So Reuven borrowed money from Shimon, and now Reuven doesn't want to, is not repaying it. But even more than that, he's not even working. He's living life. He says, why should I go to work if I work? Because I'm going to owe you the money. And we know how strong the Torah speaks about someone who does not repay their debts. The Torah speaks very strongly about the obligation a person has to repay their debts. There was once two friends that when they were in Russia, one friend lent money to the other friend, and then the person never paid him back. Many years later, they were sitting together, and the guy turned to his friend. This person who owed him money, came to collect from him more money, collect to him charity. He said, hold on, you're collecting from me charity? Before that, you have to pay up the debt you owe me. Said, okay. How am I'm in the middle of collecting money for my daughter's wedding, and you want me to pay up the $1,000 I owe you? He says, yes, there's a mitzvah of the Torah to repay the loan. He said, you're right. And he took $1,000 from the money he was raising for his daughter's wedding, and he gave it to him. And then the man went to his room, he buried around, and he came back. He said, and here's $3,000, my charity donation to the wedding. So he's like, so why didn't you just not collect on the loan? Why do you drive me crazy? He says, you don't know it's a big mitzvah in the Torah to repay your loan. So paying your loan, we took care of that. Charity is a separate business. So repaying a loan is one of the most highest values in Torah. And it's very important to keep your promises. And the Torah speaks very harshly about someone who doesn't keep their promises. Knowing all that, what do you think the rabbis have to say about this person who doesn't want to go to work? What do you think? Do the rabbis force him to go to work? Or do the rabbis say, we cannot force you to go to work? What do you think?
I think they're saying not allowed to accept any money.
What?
Not allowed to accept any money, or he can't accept any money to pay for his lifestyle.
He can't accept it from his relatives, you're saying?
Right.
Oh, interesting. Okay. What? No, but let's say they would say, if you don't go to work, you cannot come to synagogue, or, what? Right, that's a threat. We're not going to let you at the Kiddush. We're going to put you on cherem, right? Things like excommunicate you. In those days, if you lived in a Jewish community, if you're excommunicated, your life was your social outcast, you're a pariah. Let's look at case study B. This is a real case. Let's get a volunteer to read this for us. Kenya, read for us case study B, page 144.
Oh, 144.
114, sorry,
Oh,
114.
114, okay. Okay, based on Britain's Turner from New Hampshire Superior Court. Mr. Britton signed a contract to work for Mr. Turner for 1 year, for which he would be paid $120 in total, equaling $10 per month. But Britton ceased work after 9 months, and Turner was only able to find a replacement worker for the remaining 3 months for $45, equaling $15 per month. Turner did not pay Britton anything for his uncompleted contract, and Britton sued to collect pay for the work he performed.
Okay, so members of the JLI class jury, I want you to think carefully. You have a sheet in front of you, and you have to decide what is the law. Do we say, circle one of these 3 choices and think what do you feel closest to? Do we say Britton is in breach of her contract? She agreed she's going to work for 12 months. She only worked for 9 months. He has forfeited his right to any payment, and therefore he receives $0. It doesn't matter that he worked for 9 months. He broke the contract. The contract said 12 months. Therefore, he should get $0. Or do you say Britton worked for 9 out of 12 months? He should be paid pro rata for 9 months. Or do you say Britton would have been entitled to pro rata pay of 90, but his breach of contract forced Turner to hire a replacement at greater cost. Turner's loss from the fear totals 15, so this should be deducted from Britton's pay. What do you think? Is it A, B, or C?
I think C.
C. But he broke his contract. Maybe he should get
It would
0.
be B.
What?
I think it will be B.
I think it's B. Okay, you're thinking, okay. So this is the basic, here's where Torah becomes, we see on the one hand, Torah takes that, Torah tells the borrower, you have to pay your debt. At the same time, Torah puts a lot of limits on what the creditor can actually do to reclaim the debt. So let's look at text 8, Maimonides discussing debt recovery. Scripture establishes that when creditors demand payment of debts and the debtors own assets, they have things that belong to them. The debtor's existential needs must first be provided for, following which the remainder of the debtor's assets are granted for the creditors. If the debtors own no assets, or if the assets are only sufficient to provide for their existential needs, then nothing can be done to the debtors and they must not be in prison. So the first rule Maimonides sets out is that there's no such thing as a debtor's prison. What's a debtor's prison? I never heard of a debtor's prison. It was very common that people who couldn't pay their debts in other societies were thrown in prison until they somehow paid the debts by miracle, or relatives came and redeemed their debts. And this was actually a popular movement of the early Hasidic rabbis. They would go around collecting money to help pay and release Jewish families from these debts. Sometimes people would be in these debtors' prisons for as much as 30 years. If we can read that, there's a case in Argonne. Let me see if we can find it. Let's go to text 11. This is in 1824, a Londoner named John Dickens was imprisoned in the notorious Marshalsea prison for debt that he was unable to repay. Anyone know who John Dickens is or was? I'm on page 118. We're jumping ahead a little bit. Okay, anyone know who John Dickens was? John Dickens was the father of Charles Dickens. Okay, Charles is famous for many books he wrote, and what features a lot in his plots is this idea of dead prisons, because his father was in dead prison most of his life,
Wow.
and most notably in his book Little Dorrit. So let's read text 11. Someone from here. Yeah, yeah.
That prison, that was sent to jail until they were able to pay off their debts. These were called debtors' prisons. No form of punishment. Indefinite incarceration was the mode of punishment. Sometimes the convicts stayed with their families. Family members were free to come and go according to their wish. Therefore, children went on and raised them. The prisons were full of rats, lice, and fleas. The prisons were denied basic necessities of life, such as food, water, and clothing. It is said that this place was so dirty and filthy that around 25 starved to these horrible conditions. The debtors were imprisoned for fortune and the pleasure of the creditors. When other countries of Europe had legislation limiting the debt imprisonment from to 1 year, England did not have such a law. When in 1842 the prison was closed, it was found that debtors were there for more than 30 years.
So think about that. Someone couldn't pay back their loan, and they were placed in prison for 30, some people for 30 years because they couldn't pay back their loan. What was the logic? How are they going to be able to pay back their loan if they're in prison? Nobody knows, but that was the threat. And they saw it, the way they justified it was, this will incentivize other people to pay back their loan. So true, he won't be able to, but it'll make people think long and hard whether they're ready to take out a loan. And so people were dying in these prisons because they couldn't pay back a debt. What does Maimonides tell us? A person, you could seize a person's assets. Any assets that he has, you could seize as long as he has what he needs, the essential conditions. So he needs a blanket, he needs a pillow, he needs basic shelter for him and his family. And then beyond that, you could take everything. But if he has nothing else, you have to leave him alone. You have to leave him alone. That's Maimonides sets us off. Let's take this a step further. One time it was asked, in Aragon, which was before Spain, it's a territory in Spain, Aragon. And there was a Jew, also called Reuven, coincidentally, who also borrowed from Shimon, Miracles of Miracles. And he actually signed a contract with Shimon saying, I know that we don't follow the laws of debtor's prison, but in our country, everyone does follow the laws and I want to secure this loan. So I am committing myself that if I don't pay back this loan, I am signing up that you can throw me in prison, take me to the civil police, and they'll throw me in prison. Comes a few months later, Shimon wants to collect on the loan. Reuven says, I don't have. So now Shimon says, okay, so then we're going to follow what you signed into the contract, and we're going to throw you in prison. He says, hold on, we have to go to Jewish court. What do you mean we have to go to Jewish court? You signed. He says, what? We're religious Jews. We follow what the Jewish court says. They went to the Jewish court, and text 12 is the rabbi that lived there. He's writing what happened in his court. He says, Reuven borrowed money from Shimon in the contract. Reuven put up his personal freedom as collateral. I'm reading text 12. For so is the law of Aragon. If a debtor does not own available assets from which his debt can be repaid, he is incarcerated. Shimon, the creditor, now demands the repayment of his loan, but Reuven has no assets from which to pay. Shimon requests that Reuven be imprisoned as he explicitly agreed to in advance. Reuven argues that he cannot be imprisoned for his debt because there is no precedent to Jewish law for a person to be imprisoned due to debt. You requested my opinion on the law in such a case. Response. Here's my answer. Jewish law sides with Reuven the debtor, and as despicable it is that he's not keeping his word, a person cannot consent to be incarcerated. The Torah states the children of Israel belong to me as servants. They belong to God. from which we derive that they cannot be made servants to other servants. No contract clause can allow for a person to be compelled to work, not even in his regular vocation. It goes without saying that no clause can allow for a person to be incarcerated and made to languish in a dark dungeon. So he definitely can't go to prison, but we see in this answer, he also gave us an answer to case study A. Remember that scoundrel who was living life on his cousin's inherit land and saying, I'm penniless, I don't own any money, but he's living a lavish lifestyle, eating steak and eggs for breakfast, and he's not paying back his debts. He's not even going to return to his old job. So Rav Yitzchak Bar Sheshet says, yeah, we cannot compel anyone to work. We could scream at him what a horrible person he is. We could yell at him, but to compel someone to work is not a Jewish concept. We cannot force anyone to work. We can figure out other ways. We could have long talks with him. There's just the same way, if your child is disrespectful to you, can you take a bat and beat him up? No. True, he should be respectful to his parents, one of the 10 commandments, but just because your child didn't follow the 10 commandments doesn't mean you have a right to beat him up. And the same thing is, just because he's not acting righteously and doing what he can to repay his debt, we cannot force him to go back to work. And it's not just that we cannot force him, he doesn't even have a personal obligation to go to work. He has a personal obligation to repay the debt. But he can decide, working is not for me. I'm going to pray to God every day that I should win a lottery ticket. You know, if that's his way, he feels like he's doing his part to repay his debt. You know, we don't agree. We might not agree with that, but he doesn't even have a personal obligation. It's not just the court can't force him, because what are we going to do? We're going to force him. We're going to bend him down to press the stapler on the papers. Like, how are we going to force someone to work? But it's not even that. He doesn't even have a personal obligation to go to work. All he has is an obligation to repay the loan. And if that leads him to go to work, good. But it's his decision to make.
I have a question. Is a loaner allowed to ask for interest?
No.
So if you're taking out money from the bank, like a large sum, and lending it to someone, you would make, let's say, like 2% in the bank or whatever, or maybe even more if you have it in like an investment, but you're giving it away as a loan.
Yeah.
What about them just
You
paying the
just
state
did.
interest?
You just did the biggest mitzvah in the Torah, which is the highest form of charity, to give someone else a loan, but you're not allowed to give another Jew a loan with interest. And even though you're losing interest, because you could keep it in savings and, you know, get 2% interest on your money at the bank. So giving a loan, it's not free money. Your money is working for you.
It's very interesting. It's a very common thing, though, that this is what people do.
Yeah. You should know, interestingly, Rocket Mortgage, anyone heard of Rocket Mortgage?
Yes.
It's a mortgage lender, but it happens to be that it's owned by Jews. And a lot of the recipients of mortgages from Rocket Mortgage are Jews. So they cannot really be taking a mortgage from Rocket Mortgage. However, a few years ago, the rabbis got together and worked with Rocket Mortgage to create a special system called the Heter Iska, which is the kind of co-investment which allows for you to share in the profits. If his house appreciates,
Oh, interesting.
so then the investor gets that appreciation. So it's not interest, it's co-investment. So half is interest-free loan, half is investment. It's a whole complicated system, but it's Heter Iska, and Jews use it all the time amongst themselves. But and you know, Jews that do take a mortgage from Rocket Mortgage, they should make sure to ask for the Heter Iska contract.
Wow, they figured it out.
Of course they figured it out. Yeah.
So could I ask you another question? When your children are like slowly getting out of the house, and they have a job, but they can't afford everything. I know there's some parents that give their children money as a loan. Is that allowed? Like, I know, like, some parents would just be like, you're my child, of course I'm gonna.
Interest free? Interest free?
Well, yeah, I get, of course.
Interest free is a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah to give loans. There's a practice there's a Jewish community that I know of that they have a mitzvah every day. They go over to another Jew. It's a group of, they make a minyan, and person one lends money to person B, and person two lends money to person three. Person three lends money to person four, and person 10 lends money to person one. And then the next day, person one repays person 10, and it goes back in a circle because they're trying to fulfill the mitzvahs to the best. And greater than charity is the mitzvah of giving loans. So they want to participate in this mitzvah. So giving loans is absolutely a mitzvah, but giving a loan with interest is the opposite of a mitzvah. So it's balancing both. It's giving loans, and loans it's not just a mitzvah to give loans to the needy. It's even a mitzvah to give loans to the wealthy. That if a wealthy person needs a loan because he wants to start a new business, he already has 10 businesses, he wants to start a new business, if you're able to help him, it's a mitzvah to give loans amongst each other. And that's one of the secrets of Jewish success, is the brotherhood that Jews have for each other, to lend money interest-free, with the risk. There's risk in lending money interest-free. And it doesn't mean you be smart. Don't do a background check, call referrals, you can take collateral, but it's a big mitzvah to give loans. Okay, so now let's go back to another concept.
Rabbi, there's that, I don't know if you mentioned the Hebrew Free Loan Society. Do you know about that?
Oh, yeah, sure. In New York, if you need a micro loan, like a $2,000 or $10,000, there's the Hebrew Free Loan Society in New York. You could call them, and you can take out a loan interest free. And they make you give them checks that they take, that you pay it over 2 years or 3 years. And they have in Coney Island, they have a few. The Free Hebrew Loan Society. You Google it. Yeah.
So Rabbi, so many of us pay loans, right? It's common with mortgages and so on. So is that we're participating in?
The obligation is only amongst Jews, but to charge interest by Gentiles or to pay interest to Gentiles is acceptable. It's kosher.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, it's equal. And when it's said when Maimonides says the highest is to set a person on their feet, to give them a job, or to give them a loan. Yeah. It's the same principle of setting people on their feet. So there's two business partners, Marvin Himmelman and Morty Nussbaum, are the two principals of Himmelman and Nussbaum Accounting Associates. The two are in the bank for the monthly meeting with the bank manager when suddenly armed robbers burst in. While several of the robbers take the money from the tellers, others force the customers, including the accountants, up against a wall and proceed to take their wallets, watches, etc. Just before the thieves come to Himmelman and Nussbaum, Himmelman sticks something into Nussbaum's pocket. He said, "What did you put in my pocket?" He's like, "I'm just giving you the $50 I owe you. I just want to pay it now." So this is obviously, it's a mitzvah to repay debts, but there's a logic to it. So now let's discuss. So now let's take let's take a look at so now let's take a look at text 9. And this is how Rabbeinu Asher, and this is now this is obvious to us, but remember that Ashkenaz rabbi that was the chief rabbi in the Sephardic community, where he was asked about this freeloader who wasn't repaying his debt. And how did he decide? And he decided like Maddie already realized in text 9, Shimon's request that Reuven work in order to repay his debt is not something that the court can compel. The court cannot extend its jurisdiction over Reuven's actual person by compelling him to perform work in order to repay his debt. And I know from the language here, it seems like the court cannot compel, but maybe he has a personal obligation to go to work. It's debated amongst the codifiers and they go back and forth. Is it not? It seems the consensus is that he has an obligation, the highest obligation to repay his debt, but he has no personal obligation to actually go to work. And remember I said there's an exception, and that's marriage has its own rules. This is one of the cases where a husband's required to support his family, and part of that obligation is to go to work, and he has a personal obligation. The court cannot force him, but he has a personal obligation. Okay, now compare that to text 10, something that exists in the USA today. Let's get a volunteer. Bruce, can you read for us text 10?
Page?
Page 117.
Okay. Once cleared by the prison doctor, inmates can be forced to work under threat of punishment as severe as solitary confinement. Legally, this labor may be totally uncompensated. More typically, inmates are paid meagerly, as little as 2 cents per hour, for their full-time work in the fields, manufacturing warehouses, or kitchens. How is this legal? Didn't the 13th Amendment abolish all forms of slavery and involuntary servitude in this country? Not quite. In the shining promise of freedom, that was the 13th Amendment, a sharp exception was carved out. Section 1 of the amendment provides neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Simply put, incarcerated persons have no constitutional rights in this arena. They can be forced to work as punishment for their crimes.
Okay, so as progressive as the United States has come in abolishing slavery, they didn't yet catch up to Torah that says you cannot force a person to work. Even a criminal cannot be forced to work. Now, we're not advocating that there shouldn't be work opportunities for prisoners. Maybe they should, but they should be opt-in. It should be opt-in. It cannot be compelled and forced. You want to make it a program that they could work, learn a job, or rehabilitate themselves. That's fine. But to compel to work without pay or minimal pay, even if you gave a generous compensation package, but the compel to work is against the Torah. Okay, so now let's take a look. Any questions? Now we take a look at, remember that question we had about the person who quit his contract 9 months in? Does he deserve 0 or 90 or 75 because now the labor market salaries went up and now the guy has to hire new workers at a higher pay, so he's losing $15 out of this arrangement. So let's look at what the Talmud says, and it's based on the same principle. Let's look at text 13. Karen, you want to read for us text 13? Okay, what's your friend's name? Molly. Welcome, Molly. You read for us text 13, page 121. Mm-hmm.
Worker has the right to withdraw a contract even in the middle of the working day. The right of emergency
Okay. Okay, the principle is Jewish law allows employees to quit at any time. They don't have to give advance notice. They could quit at any time and they don't have to pay the difference. They have to be paid in full. Now, is it the right thing to do? Is it the menschlich thing to do? Maybe not. Maybe be compassionate to your boss, give him time to find new workers. He's taking on risk when he's running his business. It's not easy. But because of this principle of human freedom, of humans have to be free to decide that they want to devote themselves to study Torah or to do mitzvot or whatever it is that they want to do, that principle says that they can quit at any time. And they don't have to pay. Now, there's going to be exceptions, and we'll discuss that. But how do we apply it to our case? Text 14. An employee has the right to quit their job even in the middle of the day, and they are given the upper hand when calculating the pay they are entitled to receive. The quitting employee is entitled to payment for the value of work accomplished before quitting. This remains true even if the market rate for such work has since risen, leaving the employer unable to hire another worker to complete the job with the remainder of the funds. So he budgeted $120 for workers. You quit 9 months in. With the remainder budget, he won't be able to find workers for the next 3 months because the wage market went up. Doesn't matter. He has to pay the full $90. You work 9 months, you're entitled for full pay. And that's the Jewish view. However, this does not apply to contractors. There's an exception. It doesn't apply to contractors. It only applies to employees. What's the difference between a contractor and an employee? An employee is giving up his personal freedom in order to have some financial security. If at any time he wants to restore his freedom, he has the right to do so. However, a contractor has freedom to begin with. He doesn't work for the guy. He's working for himself. He's contracting out himself to the other person, and therefore he gets to set his own hours. He gets to set his own, he does whatever he wants. He's a contractor. Therefore, if he causes the other person a loss, he quits in the middle of the job performed, then he has to pay the loss that he created. So there is a difference. In other words, it's not a blanket that you could cause somebody a loss and say, it's not my problem. It depends if you're an employee or a contractor. If you're an employee, you gave up some of your freedom, you have a right to take back that freedom whenever you want. If you're a contractor, you always have your freedom. You always have your freedom, and therefore you're not allowed to quit halfway. And if you do quit, any losses that you caused, so certain losses, you become responsible. Not all losses, but certain losses. Like now it's more expensive to finish the project. The contractor reduces from his contract any money that he now put on the client. So it's a difference if we're dealing with your boss versus your client. With your client, you're the boss. So you have to restore the loss. But with an employee, the employee is the slave, so to speak. He always has a right to regain his freedom and get paid for whatever he worked in the past. And that's very different from laws that we have today. So just to put it in images, some people do better in images to understand the difference between a contractor and an employee. A contractor is self-employed. He retains his autonomy. That's why he's a contractor. Why is he doing that job? Everyone knows it's hard to be a contractor. There's no financial security. You know, you don't have the certainty that an employee has. But why do self-employed people remain self-employed despite all the risks? Because they want their autonomy. So they don't have this exception because they always retain that autonomy. However, employees give up their freedom for job security, but they have to always be allowed to restore their freedom because that's a fundamental right that the Torah provides for human beings, for Jews. Okay. So now we get this fundamental takeaway, and you notice in sharp relief, and I'm pretty sure that governments will actually come to this idea in time, that actually people will realize the importance of each person being free, and people have to be a mensch, but people cannot be compelled to stay in a job that they don't like anymore because of some contract. It's a mitzvah to honor your word and to keep your contract, but there's no, but the Torah doesn't recognize the ability to force someone to this kind of work. So, we think be free from anyone and free from anything. That's a classic view on freedom. Classic view on freedom, before we get the Torah, is I want to be free. I want to be free to cut off my hand. I can do that. Why not? It's my right. I want to be free to do nothing. That's like saying you want to liberate the fish by putting him on dry land. What do you mean? I want him to be free. What? Poor him. He never got to visit Bronx Zoo. He never got to see the White House. I want to liberate the fish. He's stuck in the Atlantic. I want to liberate the fish. But it's silly. For the fish, his life is water. He needs to stay within the confines, the limitations of water in order to thrive and realize his full fishness of being a fish. And that's the same thing with human beings. Human beings have to be allowed to assert their full humanness by receiving education, which is limiting. You're forcing your children into school. Yeah, but every child needs an education. Every child has a right to know about God. It's a right. You have to teach these things, and that gives them real freedom to know about themselves. So this is a question I'm asked often about, why don't you let your child make choices when they get older? Right? Let them grow up and let them choose. Why are you educating your child with Torah and mitzvahs? Let him come to discover it on his own terms. But it's false. When we don't educate our children, we don't give them the choice. We remove from them the choices to know about themselves. And then when they're adults, they have to explore this whole universe about themselves from scratch. And that's just not fair. So to be free, we must be ourselves. And to be ourselves, it means to express our identity, our godly spark.
Lesson 4. Beyond personal freedom. 1. Judaism teaches that true freedom is living the life we were created to live. This requires freedom from human masters and devotion to God as the one true master. 2. In the past, people could be forced into slavery for failing to repay debts. Even today, prisoners can be legally compelled to work. By contrast, Jewish law does not allow for anyone to be compelled to work against their will. 3. Debt prison was another once ubiquitous tool for debt recovery. Jewish law has always banned debt prisons, even when stipulated in a loan agreement. 4. The employer-employee relationship requires an employee to surrender a certain degree of their freedom. Jewish law protects employees from veering too close to slavery by guaranteeing their right to quit mid-contract without penalty, unless doing so would cause the employer irretrievable loss.
There's an interesting law that we'll just mention, that someone who needs a livelihood, you're a scribe, you're a teacher, and you're going to become an employee in somebody else's home, that it says it's a mitzvah for the employee not to sign a contract for longer than 3 years. And it's true, he can leave at any time, but even this concept that in his mind, he's an employee to this person for more than 3 years, it's already setting the wrong tone for himself of who his obligations are. His obligations are to God and not to other people. And therefore, he should set three-year contracts at a maximum. And in 3 years, we could take a look again and re-sign. People shouldn't sign contracts that are longer than 3-year commitments. And that's a side point. But the main reason we're learning these laws is not so much the laws, but really the value of searching for our freedom by learning more about who we are, learning about what our soul needs to thrive, what our body needs to thrive, and doing things to help us gain that freedom to living like who we really want to be. And that's a blessing for us all, that we should discover that freedom. We should discover the tools to enable our personal freedom from our inner slavery. Like one of the famous slogans is, maybe the Jew left Egypt, but did the Egypt leave the Jew? And that's a constant journey that we're on to get rid of that Egypt, that constraints, that limitations that we put on ourselves to help us break free. And so l'chaim to us all. Everyone have a wonderful night. Yeah. Next week's lesson is the spiritual dimension of ownership. Our relationship to our iPhones, our cars. You might think that Judaism cares about the soul and about God. Maybe it doesn't care about our relationship to things that we own. Maybe we don't own things, but we actually do own things. And we'll discover about the relationship between people and their stuff next week. 2 more classes. And then what? Torah never ends. There's always more Torah.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
My pleasure. Bye.
Laila Tov.
Laila
Laila-
Tov.